Pain can turn each of us into theologians. And some of the most debilitating pain I have ever been in was in the isolating depths of depression that rolled in like this thick fog, and it's rolled over, knocked me over a few times in my life. But most recently, that hazy melancholy brought me this unsettling and very humbling learning that all human beings are limited and dependent to certain degrees, including me. Be it our limits be of the intellectual kind, spiritual, physical, or emotional. At that time, in that depressive season of my life, I found myself not just feeling bumped up against my limits, but even bruised by them. My embodied limits was a real challenge for me, partly because it didn't feel so complementary with our faith. I was drawn to Unitarian Universalism because of its do-gooder optimism, the kind that blazes forward to push the boundaries of what we can do as a faith community, the one that is relentlessly committed to making progress for justice and believes in the power of transformative love. But in the down-spiritedness of my depression waves, I found myself in this moral struggle with limits. I was unable to push through. Oftentimes, I didn't have the energy to sing what were my favorite hymns, and so I certainly had no capacity to answer the call of our faith to participate in justice making. So there I was, in need of some new spiritual resourcing that could honor my disabled embodiment as a person suffering with mental illness. So I did what I always do. I went on a hunt to find theologies, ones that could educate my heart to not only pursue its potentials, but also embrace its limitations. Theologies that would not deny or depreciate my own limits or the limits of others. The limits model is one of those theologies, one of the things that I was searching for, and it comes from feminist theologian Deb Creamer. As an embodied theology of disability, the limits theology takes seriously that our bodies, our very bodies, which are good and flawed, are a primary source for spiritual enrichment and meaning-making. Limit theology attends to the human diversity, some of which we saw on display today with Together Time. Limits theology attends to the human diversity of recognizing just how common and unsurprising limits are. So instead of viewing disability as an exception to the norm, it takes the position that to be disabled is actually our most normal state of embodiedness. That disability is an expression of human limits and an intrinsic aspect of what it means to be human. That all of us are limited to varying degrees, and to be, quote, healthy is really just a temporary, transient state that varies person to person. And while we all have limits, they do differ and can be quite complex and complicated. As we go about our lives, some of our limitations are accepted, others rejected or degraded, and others of them accentuated. But it's when we deny the normality of limits in our lives that we start to dismiss disability as being an othering experience. So what happens when limits are understood as being an important part of what it means to be human, of what it means to live with a meaningful community in the wider world? What can happen is some of those dualistic categories of us versus them, of abled versus disabled, those of us who can do cartwheels and splits and those of us who can't, begins to lose its oppressive power. And in that opening space, a wider conversation can emerge. And I believe it's one that can move us out beyond that imaginary normative body and invite us back in to radical interdependence. Understood as a fluid experience, disability no longer becomes an either-or, but instead is more of a when, a where, and a how. Be it aging, experiencing the impact of the climate crisis on our health. Perhaps it's an arthritis flare-up, having to use crutches for a sports injury, going through cancer or a serious illness, or discovering new skills for a neurodivergent brain. Each of us is limited in our own unique ways. And it's when we dare to embrace our limits and the unique fluidity of them in our lives that this whole new world of theological reflection can open up for us. And I believe that faithfully honoring our limits is also an important intervention in our collective theological imagination. This is because, as a faith tradition, we've inherited universal theologies, ones that offer a common destiny. So in its earliest expressions, universalism developed within the Christian tradition, and it was radical for its very inclusive position that everybody was saved, no one was eternally damned. And that kind of universalism feels really good because it rejects theologies that fit people into separate categories, be them sheep and goats, saved or damned. And today, our more present expressions of universalism take the shape of modern philosophies, one that studies and attempts to unite many into one, ones that produce scientific knowledge that we hope and believe will be universally true. And again, I really like these universalist concepts because they make me feel safe and in control. But when my mental illness brought me outside that norm, and I could no longer assimilate into the wider universal whole, those forms of universalism became too theologically shallow for me, because we are not all the same, and universal inclusion does not always lead to justice if what is universal really just means what falls within a prescribed norm. Without a limit, universalist theologies can cause harm because they tend to perpetuate the status quo, imposing norms of a dominant culture on us, be it innocent or not. Norms that become much more obvious and life-swallowing when you find yourself on the margins. This is one reason why liberation theologians, like disability theologians, challenge the viability of universal theologies. They are adamant that experiences of difference are just as valid and just as useful. So where do we go when we can no longer rely on assumptions of universality to collectively make us all free? For me, it's right here in the intersection between disability and theology. That's where I find the spiritual maturity needed to raise my faith from being a liberal one to a liberatory one. I believe that when we youths are honest about our needs and can embrace our limits, we can actually commit ourselves to a larger vision, one that disability justice activist Mia Mingus calls liberatory access. Liberatory access is what happens when we take the time to cultivate relationships of mutuality. It's what can happen when we don't just expand access because we're trying to be inclusive, but we actually commit ourselves to expanding access as part of what it means to build an entire ecosystem of mutuality, an ecosystem that will shift our very notions of what it means to be normal. An ecosystem that still prophetically claims no one is disposable, and also we all have limits. And it's those limits that draw us to put our faith in action, that can invite us into interdependence, practices we all need to build the world we long for, a world where we take care of one another and tend to our needs. In my personal story, it was this embracing of my own limitness that matured my Unitarian Universalist faith. And the last time when those dark skies of depression clouded over, it was our tradition's tenet of interdependence that helped me compassionately and lovingly find my way alongside others. I learned that to be a UU was not only about living up to my potential, it was also about living within my limits. Limits that bring me back into relationships of communal care that were life-saving for me. May we each trust the limits of our lives, for it is the limits that can lead us to a path of interdependence, a path that will take us to collective liberation, to a place of liberatory access, a place where your people are my people too. May it be so within limits.